Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Aaron Tugendhaft. So, Dr. Tugendhaft, thank you so much for coming on to talk about your book.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks for having me.
Aaron obtained his PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University, was a Harper Fellow in the Society of Fellows at the Liberal Arts College at the University of Chicago, and is currently guest faculty member at Bard College in Berlin. His recent book, The Idols of Isis, From Assyria to the Internet, explores the connections between political life and idolatry, considering the roles Mesopotamian sculpture has played in various political situations and how digitization and social media has changed the political conversations of the modern world. And this book has been on my to-read list for, well, pretty much since it came out. So I was very excited to have a legitimate reason to sit down and read through it. So Aaron, again, thank you. This is going to be a very exciting conversation.
Thanks.
Before we get started, everyone, please remember, if you have questions for Dr. Tugendhaft, please do put them in the side chat. I'll be collecting those and reading them right at the end of the interview. So could you please give a brief introduction and explain what your specialism is and how you got into the field?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I got my PhD from NYU in Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies. I was trained there in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, and I did my PhD on Ugaritic, so Ugaritic politics, late Bronze Age. But I really bring together a whole bunch of different subjects. I studied a whole range of things. I did my BA in art history, like I said, Assyriology, and then I've been studying and teaching the history of political thought and political philosophy for a long time as well. And so it's actually was because the subject of this most recent book sort of allowed me to bring all those things together, which for a while I thought I was just studying a whole range of different things that weren't related, and the book allowed me to bring those things together.
Excellent, thank you. So what exactly prompted you to write the book?
So as you, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, in 2015, in February 2015, the Islamic State released a video of men smashing sculptures in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq. And it was a big sensation, especially among those of us who study and care about ancient Mesopotamian history. And when I saw the video, I immediately recognized a similarity, an uncanny resemblance between one segment of the video, which showed three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king that was lying horizontally on the ground, and a panel from Sargon II's palace, from the palace reliefs of Sargon II's palace at 🀭, which dates 2,500 years earlier, but being from 🀭 is only 25 kilometers away from Mosul. And so I started thinking about the relationship between these two images. I was just sort of, that uncanny resemblance made me curious, and I wanted to think more about what can be made about the fact that there was this continuity of destroying of images and also the making of images of that destruction.
Thank you. And I have to say, for anyone who is interested in the book, it's a very accessible read. There's a link in the description, and there'll be one running across the screen at different points in the interview. If you are interested in buying it, I highly recommend it. It's not expensive as far as academic books go. I think it's $18 for a paperback. And it's a very insightful, very fascinating read. And it brings together quite disparate topics that I had never thought to put together before. And it's absolutely fascinating. So could you maybe just start with explain the importance of images in the formation of a cohesive political life?
Sure. So that's really one of the key parts of the book. And thank you, by the way, for those lovely words about the book. And I have to say, I tried very, very hard to write a book that was not using any type of academic jargon, and that precisely because I was drawing on so many different fields and bringing them into conversation with one another, I really wanted to make sure that I wrote a book that didn't assume any background knowledge. So that
it definitely doesn't.
You know, so that you could come in if you were coming in as a political theorist and you know nothing about ancient Mesopotamia or vice versa or whatever, right? I tried really hard to make sure that anyone would be able to read the book. So I'm glad to hear that at least you thought that there was some success in that. And so one of the key parts is to think about for me was to think about politics and the role of images in politics. And I developed this argument mainly in the first chapter of the book called Idols, where I'm talking about the story that the ISIS video references, the story from the Quran where Ibrahim smashes the idols of the townsfolk, which the video references. And I'm using in particular the thought of Al-Farabi, the great political philosopher of medieval Baghdad, and his ideas about politics and images. And basically, to put it as simply as possible, it runs something like this. For us to live in a political community, and that's necessary, at least for someone like Al-Farabi says that if we're going to achieve happiness, we need to realize that we must live together. We're not the types of beings that can live all independently on our own. And so if we are going to live together, then there are going to have to be some restrictions on our individual desires. And those restrictions are embodied in what we call law, right? That the laws of a community are the things that will restrict our individual freedoms so that we can achieve life together, which actually makes our lives better. The problem with that is that because law is a type of restriction on freedom, it's not in itself desirable or lovable to any of us as individuals. And so the question is, how do you get people to care about the law enough to actually obey it and sort of care about the foundations of the political community in order for the political community to function? And that's where images come in. Images, the way that I'm using the word images, is really anything that excites the imagination. We can talk about moving images, not simply as films, right? The way that we talk about moving images, but images that move us in such a way that they will provide communal ideas about the good, about justice, about what we don't want, such that it gives that kind of coherence and a sense of and builds a sense of community. And so that's really the important work that images do. What's important to realize here is that images by definition are not true in a kind of philosophical or scientific sense, that they are necessarily partial. They only tell you part of the story in that sense of partial, like leaving something out, and also partial in the sense that they are directing you in a particular direction, right? So partial in that sense. And therefore, there's always a possibility for other alternative images, right? That's what it means for them not to be just representations of some type of truth, which is universally true for everyone. They're therefore they're necessarily therefore particular, and always other images could be substituted for them, which means that as a political community, we need to think about what images we want, because it's not guaranteed. There's no necessity that they have to be one set of images rather than another, but rather what are the things that we want to put emphasis on, and what are the things that we might want to leave more in the shadows.
Thank you. So one of the questions that I had while I was reading was this difference between image and icon. Do you see a difference there, or are they more intertwined than we might normally think?
Right. So idol, I would say, is
not icon. Sorry,
yeah,
idol.
Right. Just to use the language that I use in the book. So this question, right, of idols, and part of it's prompted by the fact that the spokesperson at the beginning of the ISIS video is saying that the objects that they're about to destroy are idols, and that they've been commanded to destroy idols. And then that's where they're referencing the story of Ibrahim, who again identifies these objects as idols, and therefore they have to be destroyed. What's interesting, and I think one of the things that I noticed that got me started in thinking about this, is that the story in the Quran, the Arabic words that are traditionally translated as image and idol are actually used interchangeably in the story. They go back and forth. And so I think that's indicative of something. But to try and maybe articulate this a little bit more, the way that I'm thinking about it is not that idols are different types of objects than images, but rather they're a particular way of experiencing an image. If that distinction makes sense, right? Not, and therefore, in a way, any image could be either experienced as an idol or not as an idol, depending on how you engage with it. So that's the first point. And then the second point, in a way, one could say that if we just think about the way we use language, right, and the way that we talk about the word idol, there's a kind of positive sense and a negative sense, right? So sometimes idol could be something that you really look up to, right? And in that sense, it's a god that you might submit yourself to, right? And so there are certain images that we might relate to in such a way that we identify them as the things that we submit ourselves to, and that they could be idols in that way. And to somebody else, they're just an image and not an idol in that way. And then, of course, there's the negative sense, right, that of an idol as a false god, or just simply as something false, and therefore that's what spurs maybe the impulse to destroy it, right? The desire to eradicate anything that's false. But if we think about what I was saying before about images, the necessity of images for politics on the one hand, and the necessity for images to always be partial, right? Then therefore always false in some sense. What I'm trying to get at in the book is to say that that impulse to destroy something simply because it's recognized as false is a mistaken impulse, that it's an impulse that is rooted in some type of wish that we could escape the imperfections of political life. But again, following 𝀭Farabi, it's only in political life that we can achieve any kind of happiness as human beings, no matter how imperfect that will be. And therefore, it's really important not to try to eradicate the world of images, which really turns out to be, or idols, these images that we deem to be false, because that really is an attempt to try and escape political life. And that's what I try to articulate in the book is really a mistaken impulse.
Thank you very much. So moving to the second chapter, you look in some detail at the different and changing relationships between modern cultures and ancient Mesopotamian art, looking at both the modern West and Iraq specifically. Could you talk a little bit about those relationships and how these ancient images were and still are used by different people and political regimes?
Absolutely. And so I did my best, first of all, in a short amount of space. The whole book itself is 100 pages, right? The second chapter is the longest, but it's still not that long. I did my best to tell a complicated story, right? Not a simplified story of that there's one narrative of how ancient Near Eastern objects have acquired meaning or what their meaning is since they've been rediscovered in the 19th century, but rather to tell it as a series of interweaving stories. And interweaving both in terms of maybe the two big strands, right, are, as you mentioned, the story of how they've been received and given meaning in the West, and then also how they've been received and given meaning in Iraq since the middle of the 19th century. But I really wanted to show that those two strands themselves are complicated, right, and that those themselves have complicated inner strands. So to briefly give a sense of what I'm dealing with there. So in the West, right, we can begin with the very beginning, the first excavators that were coming from England and from France, and so this is connected to imperial competition between those two countries. But then there's also a way that these objects are reinterpreted as at the foundation of civilization, right? This term that we hear all the time of the Iraq or the Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization, and then so somehow they're then given the sense of being representative of humanity, and this was something that was also repeated endlessly in response to the video, because these were thought to be, human heritage that was being destroyed. And I think that's deeply connected. We could say that maybe all of heritage is human, but the fact that Mesopotamia in particular has been given this sense of being at the cradle of civilization that adds to it. And I tell an anecdote about Victor Hugo in the book, which maybe I'm not going to restate it here unless someone asks later for me to restate it. But for those of you who do get a hand on the book, I highly recommend. It's I think a wonderful vignette or anecdote about the French poet Victor Hugo in relationship to Mesopotamia and this notion of humanity. And then I tell some other stories, for example, how artists who were interested in trying to get at some alternative to classicism were inspired by these objects that offered a kind of way to get behind the Greco-Roman tradition and find other things. So there are a bunch of different stories going on. With respect to Iraq, the story I tell begins with a figure named Ahmed Sakir Bey, who was an Ottoman official when this was still the Ottoman Empire, and he was sailing sort of in the river and while he was doing a number of studies, he was also interested in the antiquities that he was finding along the shores. And this was sort of the first time that these antiquities were being written about in a local Baghdadi newspaper. What I find particularly interesting is that the ruins that he most speaks about in these articles that he was sending back to his newspaper about Iraqi heritage and trying to sort of create a sense of Iraqi heritage that didn't yet exist were the ruins of 𝑀‭Europos, which, if anyone is familiar with a map, after World War I, that infamous line in the sand that was established by Sykes-Picot put 𝑀‭Europos on the wrong side of the border if we're talking about Iraqi heritage, right? It's in what's today Syria. And so it's sort of ironic that the first attestation that I was able to find of a local Iraqi trying to identify Iraqi heritage actually would not count as Iraqi heritage according to the international scheme that we are living under today, right? And then I tell other stories about Gertrude Bell setting up the first Museum of Iraqi Antiquities when the modern state was founded, and the idea of using these objects as a way to bring together a kind of Iraqi identity, which was not universally agreed to as a good goal. And so her colleague, Sati al-Hustari, who was the head of the education department at the time, who was a Pan-Arabist, was deeply opposed to this use of Mesopotamian antiquities to build an Iraqi identity that would mark Iraq as separate or different from Arab heritage or Arab culture more generally, where other Arab peoples wouldn't be able to identify with that, right? And then finally, I lead all the way up to Saddam Hussein, who was really into ancient Mesopotamian heritage. I have some wonderful images in the book, as you know. And he really made ancient Mesopotamian heritage his own, to the point that he was rebuilding, Babylon and having bricks cast in cuneiform with his name on them, just in the same way that the great, Assyrian and Babylonian rulers of antiquity would have. And so he was just, adding to that, right? And so I try to tell a complicated story so that it, sort of keeps you sort of on your toes. And maybe the last thing I can say here is that I would consider the ISIS video itself as one of the most recent moments or kind of recent chapter in this long history of reception, right? And so it too belongs to the ways that ancient Mesopotamian objects have been received and given meaning since their rediscovery in the 19th century.
Thank you. And you're right, it is an immensely complicated story, and it was fascinating for me. I'm very familiar with the Western narrative from research that I've done for various videos and just books I've read, and having such a good explanation and stories relating to the Iraqi side of things was absolutely fascinating. When you're researching that kind of material, sorry, I sent Dr. Tugendhaft a list of questions beforehand. This is not a pre-prepared question, so I'm kind of springing this on him. When you're researching for this kind of historical narrative, how difficult is it to find sources?
So I had a little bit of help. I should, thanks to the University of Chicago, where I was working at the time, I was able to hire some research assistants who knew certain things better than I did. And so, for example, that story of Ahmed Sakir Bey was brought to my attention by a wonderful graduate student who helped me with that. I should say I was also able to hire a graduate student to play first-person shooter video games for me, because I was unable to do that myself, and I needed that for another part of the project, which was to think about the relationship between ISIS videos and games like Call of Duty. So I'm grateful for that. And yeah, I mean, it was also fun. I mean, so I had help. Right. And anyone, there's a long list of names in the back of the book of acknowledgements, and I decided to just list the names. And I probably forgot people, but anyone who knew me during the 5 years that I was working on this project knows that I was asking them for information. Right. And so, yeah. And then there was just the joy of reading really, really widely. Which was part of what was so fun about writing this book. It gave me the right to just let my curiosity run wild in a lot of ways.
It definitely is like for something that is relatively short in terms of like academic books, it's very wide ranging. And you kind of dip into lots of different fields. It was honestly a joy to read.
And parts ended up, on the editing floor, I have to say, right? So I do have the section on first-person shooter video games, but the section in which I talk about what the German jurist Carl Schmitt would have thought about first-person shooter video games had he known of them, had he not died before they came out, that ended up having to not be part of the book. So, what can you do?
Hang on, sorry. The postman has arrived and my dog is going mental. Sorry. So I have one more question for Dr. Tugendhaft. So if the audience has questions, now is a good time to get them in, because I have, like I said, one more that I've prepared, and then I want to circle back around to the first-person shooters and the ISIS videos, because that was a fantastic connection that I very much enjoyed. But you make the point in several places that iconoclasm is actually its own form of image making. So iconoclasts are actually preserving, recreating, and recycling the very thing they're trying to destroy. Would you elaborate a little bit on that for the audience?
Sure. Right. So, like I said, the whole story, or the project got started when I realized the similarity between the video and this panel from Sargon II's palace. And of course, I wouldn't have known about that iconoclasm, right, had it not been represented. Right. And I mean, one of the things very often we make mistakes especially with filmic or photographic material, that we think that it's just giving us the thing itself. Right. But it really, I mean, if you think about the video, especially this ISIS video, it's not just a recording of an event, and that itself would be an image of image destruction. Right. But it was also highly edited. There parts in slow motion, there's parts that are sped up, there's a very haunting soundtrack, both in terms of music, interspersed with machine gun fire and a whole bunch of things, right? So it's a very elaborately crafted image in its own right, as was the image from Sargon II's palace. And so I really was thinking about what is that all about? And so if I can elaborate this perhaps by bringing us back to that story of Ibrahim smashing the idols in the Quran, right? Which itself was depicted visually, right? So first of all, the story itself, the fact that it's a story by my definition, a story is also a kind of image because it produces something in our imagination. So whether we talk about the story of Ibrahim in text, right? Or visual reproductions of that story, or representations of that story. And I include one in the book. Here also we have an image of image destruction, right? And in the case, in the Islamic case, I think what one could say is that this is an image, the story of Ibrahim, whether visual or in text, is an image that's meant to trick us perhaps into thinking that a life without images is possible. Mm-hmm. Right? And it doesn't make it any less of an image for that, right? But it's a specific kind of image, and it's a very successful image, right? An entire, vibrant, incredibly rich, incredibly culturally productive community, right, has been formed and transformed. You know, I don't want to reduce Islam right now, but I'm just trying to make the general point, right? Mm-hmm. That this is an incredibly generative image for a political community to orient itself around, but it's an image that does convey the idea that images are not necessary and that access to God or submission to God directly is somehow possible. And I think that's worth thinking about that. The other example that I go into great detail about is the Sargon II relief, right? And as many of your audience listeners know, there's a kind of imperial ideology of the Neo-Assyrian Empire that presented itself as the one legitimate political entity that stretched across every corner of the earth, right? And that this was a world state, right? And that this was a universal political entity, and that was the one legitimate one. And if other ones might have existed, they were illegitimate. They were represented as insurgents, right? But that the ideal was that for the Assyrian king to rule the entire earth and all of humanity, and in that sense, bring all of humanity together. And I relate this to the story of the Tower of Babel, also, and the question of political unity and multiplicity elsewhere in the book. But I can leave that aside. But so that, for me, that raises this question, right? If your images, right, these palace reliefs, are trying to convey the idea to an audience that Assyria is the only state, right? That it is the only state. Why then put on your wall, right, an image of another king, even if it's an image of another king being destroyed, right? Because in a sense, anyone who sees that in a sense can say, wait a second, other images are possible, right? That the Assyrian king claims to have a monopoly on images, but it's not actually true. These other images are possible. And what I tried to develop there is a way of thinking that, well, the claim that you do have a complete monopoly on images is never fully believable. And so what I try to articulate there is that how might it make sense to put that image there? We'll say, well, okay, yes, you might think that there are these other images possible, but I'm going to show you that they are weak, or they're the product of insurgents, or they're illegitimate in certain kinds of ways, right? And so, and I think that that's a larger point about images of image destruction that go up until this current summer, with the images that we saw of, whether it's statues of Churchill or statues of Robert E. Lee being torn down, right? Part of it is about trying to, cleanse the world of those images, but it's really important for that cleansing to be captured on film and to be made visible, in order for the audience of those images, I would say, right, to recognize that this is a political statement, that that the images that are being torn down are illegitimate, are wrong, right? And it's not really about cleansing so much as identifying what we hold to be true or correct for us and what we can consider to be contemptible.
Thank you very much. One last question before we take a brief break and then have audience questions. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the connection between the first-person shooter games, Call of Duty, and the ISIS videos?
Oh, Sure. So this is not something that I discovered when the videos during that period when all the videos were coming out around 2015. A number of people were identifying how there were similarities between the videos that were made and certain scenes in the first-person shooter video games, and there were also related types of images where ISIS was presenting the caliphate sort of through the advertising images that the images that would advertise Call of Duty. Where I tried to take the conversation a step further is that most of that conversation focused on how the connection to first-person shooter video games was meant to just kind of as a recruiting technique, that young people, especially young males, are really into these video games, and therefore we make the videos that are supposed to appeal to them look similar to those video games, and that's going to kind of entice them to join the caliphate. And I think that as far as that goes, that's fine. But what I try to do in the book is to try and suggest that what is it that's really appealing about these video games? Or to put it another way, what is appealing about the idea of living within a video game, right? Because it's one thing to play Call of Duty, on your couch every now and then leave, shut off the game and then go about the rest of your life, and then every now and then return to it when you're playing. But to say that the caliphate itself, right, to pick the caliphate as a place that is an embodiment on earth of a video game, and that you should come there, is to say that you want to actually enter into the video game and live inside of the video game in a certain respect. And I tie that to what I was talking about before, this impulse to escape politics. And I mean, that's really sort of a strand that runs through the entire book. What is it about video games, the dream of living in a video game, which is a dream of living in a place where my local movement is up to me, but ultimately the real questions that require deliberation and judgment about how we should live and what should be considered the good, well, within those video games, that's predetermined for you, right? You can choose not to play, but once you're playing, you need to follow the goals that the game has set for you. And in a sense, that what I want to at least tie that to this idea of abdicating our capacity for politics, which is our capacity for actually engaging in that difficult work of judgment and deliberation with other people, where the good is not just given to us, but it's something that we need to actually determine for ourselves in together with others through communal political life.
It's kind of like an abdication of personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. I am going to go to a very brief break. So audience, if you have extra questions, please do get them in now, and we will be back in 60 seconds. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. Hello, everybody. We are back. We have 2 audience questions, so thank you both very much. First of all is Anna de Mars. She says, why did it happen that sometimes in the ancient world, images were simply relocated or kidnapped from winning powers and sometimes destroyed? Was there criteria for deciding between destruction or kidnapping?
Ooh. It's a nice question. I don't think I will be able to answer it. I know that I know of both of the cases, but whether there are criteria for kidnapping or destroying. I wish I had wisdom to provide there, but I don't think. Megan, do you have thoughts on this?
I don't know. It is an excellent question.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say maybe images that were too difficult to relocate. It was simply easier to destroy them, or if it wasn't worth moving them. But
sure, I mean, right, but I mean, I haven't done the. All I can say is how I would try to go about the question, right? Which is I would want to look more at the images that were sort of kidnapped or godnapped and removed, and sort of think systematically through those examples if we see some type of common denominator there. And a number of my friends are much more expert on that side of things. But it's a wonderful question, and I wish I had better things to say.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, we can't give you a definitive answer to that. And second, 𝀭Support says, do we have any idea how much imagery from ancient Mesopotamia was destroyed in Muhammad's time?
So that's, again, I don't have an exact answer, right? So we know that there are stories of destruction in Muhammad's time, though. Again, here, if we want to be very, very precise, it depends on what we mean by ancient Mesopotamia and what was, like the story about Muhammad cleansing out idols from the Kaaba in Mecca, right? Is not, those aren't going to be objects that we might associate, with ancient the Neo-Assyrian Empire or the Babylonian Empire or something like this, right? So it really depends on what our terms are, and those images themselves, right? They're complicated stories about how Abraham had already emptied them out, and then images returned, and then they were emptied out again, and so there are complicated stories about that. There are also early medieval Islamic accounts of the recognition that that tells, right, these mounds that cover ancient sites. There was recognition that these were ancient, from ancient civilizations, which is, by the way, why some of them ended up receiving the name Nimrod, right? So one of the videos that ISIS released was the destruction of the palace at the site that's in modern times or from medieval times called Nimrod, and that's because of an association with this King Nimrod in the Islamic imaginary, right? So within medieval Islamic imagination, the figure of Nimrod comes to stand in a sense, for all of the great kings or emperors of ancient Mesopotamia. And so that story about Ibrahim smashing the idols gets developed in later traditions as this conflict between Ibrahim and Nimrod, and sort of a representation of the old regime, so to speak, and the young upstart with the new regime. So those are some thoughts on that material. Unfortunately, as you can see, I know more about the way that these things were thought about, and not so much about the actual. I think the question was about the actual physical number of objects that were physically destroyed, and unfortunately, I don't know about that.
Well, thank you for giving us your thoughts regardless. And that is actually all the questions that we had for you. Thank you again so much for joining us. This was really interesting.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Of course. Everybody, thank you all for watching. Thank you for bringing your questions. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.